Part 4 of this chapter is going to deal with how we cope with stress. How do people handle stressful situations? What strategies do we use, and what's the best way to deal with stress? There are lots of different ways that you can decide to respond to a stressor, but coping strategies can generally be divided into 3 broad classes. So those are what we're going to discuss when we're trying to decide which strategy is best. So we're going to flip back and forth between these 2 slides. But the 3 broad categories we're going to focus on are problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, and seeking social support. For problem-focused coping, your strategies are basically to confront and deal directly with the demands of the situation, or to try and change the situation itself so that it's no longer stressful. So you are focused on the problem, and you're going to deal with it or change it directly. So methods of using this problem-solving or problem-focused coping would be if you plan to try and face a situation. You're going to plan how you're going to respond to a situation. If you suppress your competing activities. So I know that I have a big paper due in the next couple of days. I'm going to plan to write a little bit every day. I'm going to suppress any competing activities. I'm going to make sure I don't have other assignments due at the same time. I'm not studying for anything else. You can exercise restraint, so make sure that you're not going to be distracted. Maybe you turn your phone off. Maybe you close your browser so you can't be on social media. These are all problem-focused coping methods or coping strategies, and these are pretty effective, which is why our problem-focused coping strategies end up under this heading for which strategies are best. Seeking social support is also a really good strategy. So let's talk about that one next. We're going to skip over emotional and come back to it in a minute. So if you are seeking social support, you are turning to others for assistance, turning to others for emotional support when you're stressed. So if you're trying to handle a really stressful term, maybe you're going to talk to your friends about how overwhelmed you feel, and maybe they're going to tell you, calm down, or we're going to help you out. Here are some tricks you can try. So you can get help and guidance from others. They can make you feel valid by supporting the emotions you're feeling, making you feel like it's okay to feel them. They give you affirmations of worth. They tell you that everyone's struggling. This isn't making you a bad person. You're just having a rough time. You are still valid. And they can even give you tangible aid. So if you're struggling, maybe someone helps you study. Maybe someone gives you money so you don't have to worry about buying food. All sorts of different ways that others can help support you. And so because of these positive outcomes associated with these 2 types of coping strategies, those 2 tend to work fairly well when you're handling stress. Now we're going to go back to emotion-focused coping strategies. And these are a little bit more of a mixed bag, where we can have some positive outcomes, but also some negative outcomes. So when we're dealing with these emotion-focused coping strategies, these happen when you're trying to manage your emotional responses that are resulting from a stressful situation. So how do you handle your emotional response to what's going on? And so some of these strategies can be negative. So if you try and deal with it by avoiding the issue, so you avoid that situation so you don't have to emotionally deal with it, it's going to lead you to a negative outcome. Same thing with denial, where you deny that it's happening. It's going to lead to negative outcomes. And wishful thinking is also unhelpful, where you wish that things were a different way, that you weren't in this situation, that instead of this stressor, there was something else. None of those are super helpful. You can experience positive outcomes if you start identifying and changing irrational thought patterns. So if you change how you think about the situation, and therefore how you feel about the situation, it can help you handle that stress better. Going through relaxation techniques, if you calm your breathing, try and slow your heart rate down, that can actually help you handle the stress better because you're calming some of those intense emotional reactions. So Problem-focused and social support strategies seem to be overall positive, but emotion-focused strategies are a little bit of a mixed bag here. But of course, that's a very simplified overview. And we should probably keep in mind that any of those strategies, no one strategy is going to work in every single situation. So sometimes you can't always change a situation. So when I had talked about you have a paper coming up and you want to plan and get rid of other competing activities and exercise restraint, well, what if the situation isn't something that you can change the problem? What if you have 4 different assignments that are due in the same week and the only time you can work on them is that week? Well, then you can't get rid of competing activities. If you're waiting for a really important phone call or there's something going on and you have to have your texts available all the time, it's really hard to restrain yourself from checking your phone. So it's not always viable to use certain types of methods of adapting. And so in these situations where you have very little control over what's going on, that's when you can actually benefit from using those emotion-focused coping mechanisms. You end up with fewer maladaptive behaviors if you could do something like relaxing your breathing, slowing your heart rate. So if you focus on helping yourself adapt to that situation, if you focus on more adaptive behaviors, then maybe it's going to work out better. But again, no strategy is going to work in all situations. Different strategies work in different cases. So the next section starts talking about the costs of bottling up or holding on to or constraining our feelings. So there's lots and lots of research that shows that talking about and sharing your negative emotions and negative experiences can actually help people cope better with stressful situations. But we also have that feeling that, well, if I'm always going to my friends and I'm always venting, if I'm always just complaining and telling them negative things and how bad things are, then that might not be great for my friendship. So we kind of have to find this middle ground. So do you complain to your friends? Do you vent those negative feelings? Do you keep them to yourself? What's the best strategy here? If you can't express those negative feelings, if you end up bottling up all of those negative side effects or those negative things that you're experiencing, studies show that you have a higher likelihood of cancer. So maybe that's to do with reduced immune system or using up extra resources. But there's this link between holding things in, not venting and sharing things, and being more likely to have cancer. So there's quite a bit of research that shows this link between this inability to express your negative feelings and poor health as a result, or possibly both correlated. So expressing your emotions in a more adaptive manner is going to have more long-term positive consequences. So even though it isn't great to always vent to your friends, venting every once in a while is going to be a lot healthier, at least according to the research. And for just a little bit of visual evidence of this, we can look at these graphs, which come from a study where they had students who had gone through different stressful events, and one group was told to write about the stressful event that they had gone through, to sort of put it down on paper, and the other group did an unrelated activity. They were a control group. And so if we look at this graph here, we can look at our baseline, which is at the beginning of the study. So when the participants first came in, they were asked, what kind of traumatic events have you gone through? And they were asking, how many sick days have you taken? And the idea here being that the more sick days that you take, probably poorer health and poorer outcomes. And at the beginning, people who shared their emotions versus hadn't shared their emotions, it didn't matter. Both were sitting at, about 3 sick days each. But over time, when they had the participants come back a couple of weeks later, those who had shared, who had vented about what they had experienced, were still sitting at about the same 3 sick days. But those who hadn't discussed, who hadn't vented about those negative things they'd experienced, they were showing much higher incidences of sick days. So more negative health outcomes. And we can also look at this graph here where we were looking at symptoms of stress and depression. And this is an interesting axis here. We're looking at our mean percentage change. So how much did their score of stress and depression change between the baseline when they first came in and the follow-up session when they came in a couple of weeks later? For our greenish bars, the groups that were able to disclose what they had gone through, who vented, showed a negative change where over time they became less stressed. They showed less signs of depression. But our control group stayed about the same or even got worse. So they were showing a slightly positive change. So they were becoming more stressed or more depressed over time as opposed to less. So this study is one of many that was showing that people who were able to vent, who were able to share their negative experiences, did better over time. Now, this next section is really interesting. We start to get to look at gender and culture differences in coping mechanisms and how people cope with stress. So let's start with gender differences. And again, as I always mention, because it's intro psych, we tend to focus on the very basic binary of male versus female. But when you get into the field of stress and health and coping, you can actually look at the whole spectrum of different genders, and it's really cool research if you get the chance to delve more into this in the future. But we're going to keep it simple. We're going to look at just male versus female broad categories. So males tend to favor problem-focused approaches. So they're going to focus on the problem itself. They're going to do this type of coping mechanisms with planning or getting rid of competing activities, being restraintful, those kinds of things. Females tend to favor emotion-focused approaches where they try and handle their own emotional response to the situation. So males are going to be focusing on the problem, the stressor, what's causing the stress, and females are going to focus on their response to that stressor. Now, these are just tendencies. This isn't saying that every female is going to have an emotional focused approach to stressors in all situations, just a tendency. And it's pretty difficult to tell sort of what's driving this difference here, but maybe it's something to do with socialization. Basically, what are we raised to expect? How do we think we're supposed to handle stress? And a couple other factors as well. So if we think about how we're raised, males tend to be raised to think that they need to be more independent, self-sufficient, where they don't have to rely on others. Whereas females tend to be raised to think that they should be emotional and open and reaching out to others for support. So that could help explain which strategies they think is more effective, the strategies that they think they should be employing. In terms of cultural differences, we actually see overall trends where people from North America and Europe tend to use problem-focused coping mechanisms. And people who are of Asian or Hispanic descent tend to use more emotion-focused coping mechanisms. Now, this might have something to do with how cultures handle stress or how they interpret different situations. For example, in Asia, the culture tends to emphasize interpersonal harmony. So they might try and avoid stressful situations, especially those that are interpersonal stressors, where they might be disagreeing with others. So that might influence why they would choose to find these emotion-focused coping mechanisms instead of something more problem-focused. But again, very complex concept with lots and lots of really interesting research to look into.